What if I told you that the rent you pay for your apartment or house is not determined by the market forces of supply and demand, but by the hidden hands of powerful and wealthy interests, who manipulate the housing market for their own benefit? What if I told you that these interests include not only landlords and developers, but also banks, corporations, politicians, and even foreign investors? Welcome to the world of rising rent, the hidden hands behind skyrocketing housing costs. In this video, we will explore some of the most controversial and conspiratorial aspects of rising rent. We will also examine how rising rent affects various aspects of society, such as affordability, inequality, mobility, and sustainability. But before we dive into the details, let's first define what rent is. Rent is the amount of money that tenants pay to landlords for the use of a property. Rent can vary depending on the location, size, quality, and amenities of the property. Rent can also vary depending on the supply and demand of housing in a given area. But who sets the rent? And what factors influence it? The rent is usually set by the landlord, who owns or manages the property. The landlord can charge whatever rent they want, as long as it is legal and agreed upon by the tenant. The landlord can also increase or decrease the rent at any time, subject to certain rules and regulations, and the rent is influenced by various factors, such as the cost of construction, maintenance, taxes, utilities, insurance, and financing. Rent is also influenced by the demand for housing, which depends on factors such as population growth, income levels, preferences, and availability of alternatives. The landlords and tenants claim that their rent is fair and reasonable, based on the market conditions and their contractual obligations. They claim that their rent reflects the value and quality of the property and the services they provide or receive. They claim that their rent is subject to negotiation and competition, and that they have the freedom to choose or change their housing options. However, not everyone agrees with these claims. Many people argue that rent is unfair and unreasonable, based on the manipulation and exploitation of the housing market by powerful and wealthy interests. They argue that rent does not reflect the true value and quality of the property and the services they provide or receive. They argue that rent is subject to coercion and monopoly, and that they have no freedom to choose or change their housing options. Are these arguments valid? Or are they just exaggerated complaints? The truth is hard to find out, because rent is complex and opaque, and has different impacts on different sectors and groups of society. It is difficult to measure and evaluate the costs and benefits of rent, and to compare them with alternative scenarios or solutions. It is also difficult to isolate the influence of rent from other factors that affect society, such as culture, ideology, or media. But what is clear is that rent has a significant impact on society, and that not everyone benefits or suffers equally from it. This is one of the realities that confronts society and challenges its legitimacy and integrity. To illustrate this point, let us look at some historical examples of rising rent, and the hidden hands behind it. One example is the housing bubble that burst in 2008, which was caused by the subprime mortgage crisis. The subprime mortgage crisis was when banks and lenders gave out risky loans to borrowers with low credit scores or incomes, who wanted to buy houses that they could not afford. These loans were then packaged into securities and sold to investors who wanted to make profits from the rising house prices. However, when house prices started to fall due to oversupply and lack of demand, many borrowers defaulted on their loans, causing investors to lose money and banks to collapse. The result was a global financial crisis that affected millions of people, who lost their homes, jobs, or savings. But who was behind this crisis? And what were their motives? According to some analysts and critics, the crisis was orchestrated by a network of powerful and wealthy interests, who manipulated the housing market for their own benefit. These interests included not only banks and lenders, but also corporations, politicians, regulators, rating agencies, and even foreign governments. These interests had various motives, such as increasing their profits, power, or influence. They used various methods, such as lobbying, bribery, fraud, or deception. They also used various tools, such as derivatives, securitization, or leverage. These interests were able to get away with their actions, because they had control over the policies and laws that governed the housing market. They also had influence over the media and public opinion that shaped the perception of the housing market. They also had connections with the institutions and organizations that monitored and regulated the housing market. But they did not care about the consequences of their actions on the economy and society. They did not care about the millions of people who suffered from their actions. They only cared about their own interests and agendas. Another example is the gentrification that is happening in many cities, which is caused by the influx of affluent residents into low-income neighborhoods. Gentrification is when a neighborhood undergoes changes in its physical, social, and economic characteristics, due to the arrival of wealthier people who displace the original residents. These changes include the improvement of infrastructure, services, and amenities, the increase of property values, rents, and taxes, and the transformation of culture, identity, and diversity. But who is behind this phenomenon? And what are their motives? According to some analysts and critics, gentrification is driven by a network of powerful and wealthy interests, who manipulate the housing market for their own benefit. These interests include not only affluent residents, but also developers, landlords, investors, and politicians. These interests have various motives, such as enhancing their lifestyles, profits, or power. They use various methods, such as buying, renovating, or demolishing properties, raising rents, evicting tenants, or rezoning areas. They also use various tools, such as subsidies, incentives, or regulations. These interests are able to pursue their actions, because they have access to the resources and opportunities that enable them to enter and dominate the housing market. They also have influence over the policies and laws that facilitate or constrain their actions. They also have connections with the institutions and organizations that support or oppose their actions. But they do not care about the consequences of their actions on the community and society. They do not care about the thousands of people who are affected by their actions. They only care about their own interests and agendas. These are just some examples of how rising rent and the hidden hands behind it have affected various aspects of society. There are many more, such as the impact of rent on health, education, mobility, or sustainability. Some of these impacts may be positive or negative, depending on the perspective and the context. But they all demonstrate the power and influence of rent, and the hidden hands behind it in shaping policies and laws that affect millions of lives. These are some of the most controversial and conspiratorial aspects of rising rent, and the hidden hands behind it. There are many more, such as the origin, history, and legality of rent and the hidden hands behind it, the role and influence of rent and the hidden hands behind it in international affairs, or the future and alternatives of rent, and the hidden hands behind it. Some of these aspects may have some truth or merit to them, while others may be completely false or absurd. But they all reflect a common concern, and distrust of rent and the hidden hands behind it and their power over society. Rising rent and the hidden hands behind it are fascinating subjects for research and debate. They reveal a hidden side of society that is often overlooked or ignored by mainstream sources. They also challenge us to question our assumptions and beliefs about how society works. But we should also be careful not to fall into paranoia or fantasy when dealing with rising rent and the hidden hands behind it. We should always seek evidence and logic before accepting any claims or theories about them. With that said, Thanks for watching, and until next time.